Thank you. Good morning. I am Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams, and I am here with two officers. Ironically, they both served with me when I was a lieutenant in the 8-8. And as I started receiving calls about this matter on 9/11 related illnesses, and I started to realize that there was a pattern that was developing. The first time I heard about some of the concerns took place 2 years ago when a retired sergeant, he was the first one that called me and stated that the officers are receiving some type of runaround, and I wanted to dig into it more. I think it's important to really take your mind back 17 years on what happened on 9/11. And although I was off duty at the time, I immediately knew, based on the severity of the attack, that we were trained whenever something of that magnitude happens, we are to immediately get deployed to our neighboring precinct or to the closest precinct to where we are as we start the process of responding to the emergency at hand. This was the same thing that was done during the blackout. This is the same thing that is done anytime you have a major catastrophic citywide or national emergency. And when I responded as the platoon commander in the 88th precinct, I was surprised at the level of just helter-skelter that was in front of us. And as disciplined as the police department is, it was extremely challenging to wrap our hands around the number of deaths of officers, the number of deaths of firefighters, the collapse of the trade center, just the total despair. And it took everything in all of us as professionals, because it was something we never experienced before. No matter how many reports of crimes and no matter how many emergencies we responded to in my years in the police department, we never came up against anything at the level of 9/11. The last thing that was on our minds was the paper that's associated with documenting where you were and where you were deployed and how long you were deployed there. There were some, as you're going to find out from Maureen, who retired as a lieutenant and was a sergeant at the time. There were some that tried their best to document every deployment of the officers, because officers were being reassigned. They were going from election duty to the deployment location, the mobilization location, and they were deployed across the bridge. It was so many moving pieces, and it was virtually impossible to properly record all those moving pieces. And what we're finding that is very important, that the police department gave to the law department a large volume of records, roll calls, and other records that would indicate where the officers were. Mysteriously, some of those records are missing, or they're cannot put in a proper manner that they're easily retrievable. We are talking about the New York City Police Department that can find a command log going back to the early 1900s, but they don't have all the records for 9/11. Something is fishy. And I'm asking Councilman Torres and Councilman Donovan Richards to conduct an investigation to find those records. And if those records can't be found, someone must be held accountable. But you cannot deny documented 9/11 related illnesses for the officers because of the sloppy record-keeping and retention of the police department. It is drilled and drained in our heads as officers, as lieutenants, as sergeants, as captains, that the proper chain of command of evidence is something that we all know too clear. And when you hear the cases of these officers and what they have gone through, our officers should not have to fight against terrorism and then fight the agency that is supposed to provide them with the basic medical care that comes after their response to this horrific attack. They were not reluctant in traveling to ground zero. We should not be reluctant in ensuring that they receive the proper payment. What the police department is currently doing, the pension board, they're requiring multiple forms of proof of the presence of the officers. Even if that officer is placed on the roll call, they're still requiring more proof that they were at the 9/11 site during a particular time, even if they don't have the proof, as in they being the department. Their more onerous standard in other pension is more onerous than other pension agencies informed, and they are actually going outside the guidelines that the World Trade Center Health Program is actually requiring of the officers. They're caught up in bureaucratic red tape, not allowing them to move forward after their injuries are documented and medically established. The pension board is now the impediment that's prevented them from moving forward and ensuring that for the rest of their lives and their family lives that they're able to take care of themselves. This is a pension section, a police department, and a law department problem that 17 years later we're finding out. The police department is stating that they have approved 1,009 cases, I believe. 1,000 cases, and 9 cases were not handled currently or turned down for denial. The real problem is not our current state, but these future injuries. The record shows, as was reported in today's paper, the Daily News, 90,000 first responders reported for duty at the Trade Center. Many of them have not had the injuries revealed on the impact of being down at that toxic mix of dust and poison that caused some of the injuries that we are hearing about. And so if those officers are going to have to dig through and find memo books, locate other members of the department to have affidavits signed, try to get records that the department can't find, we are further traumatizing those officers who went through the level of trauma that took place on 9/11. And I remember clearly those hours after 9/11 and what we went through and how difficult it was, and the lack of hesitation of officers immediately responding to that dangerous situation. So I'm calling on the NYPD Pension Board to allow 9/11 first responders to provide a single form of documentation that we will have an or system and not an and system. If they have a roll call or a memo book or some radio transmission, any of those items will qualify them when you compare it with the sickness, 9/11 related sickness that they're going through. And this is clearly in standard with the federal government. We have also, as we looked into this situation, we're clearly concerned about reports that our EMT and paramedics, whose pensions are governed by the New York City Employee Retirement System, have had a higher percentage of their claims denied than firefighters and fire officers whose pensions are governed by the FDNY Pension Fund. So, same tragic incident, Same dedication to response, 2 different pension funds, 2 different responses from those who are involved. And we clearly want to thank Gail Brewer, the Manhattan Borough President, for raising the red flag on this, and we're looking for the NYSERS and NYSERS members to move forward to make sure this issue is resolved. And so we're standing here in front of the 9/11 banner, 266 Brooklynites who died that day. As painful as these losses have been and continue to be, the tragedy of 9/11 has grown every year with the first responders as we continue to hear these terrible diagnoses. Both Office Detective Dedanzine in her battle with breast cancer, and Lieutenant Maureen with her battles with ovarian cancer, the countless number of other family members who've had similar battles. They knew that if they give their all, that the city would be here to give them their all. But it appears as though the further we move from 9/11, we've said we will never forget, but too many agencies must have forgotten. But we're not going to forget. And we're asking all of our unions and all of our elected officials to be here for these men and women who gave their all on September 11th. I want to ask Maureen now to come and just talk about some of the typical cases that officers are going through when it's time to report their 9/11 related injuries. Maureen?
How are you? Good morning. My name is Maureen Donahue. In September of 2014, I was diagnosed with ovarian cancer related to my work at Ground Zero. After I had completed chemo and surgery, and I had applied for the pension board, they didn't have me down as having been there enough. Despite roll calls, detail rosters, I was there approximately 400 hours, and it was my understanding from speaking to them that all the records that were taken and held by the law department and the police department were all moshed together. Not in any date order, not in any precinct order, not in anything. They didn't have me down as having been there much, and it was only for the fact that I had saved my memo books that I was able to prove that I was down there. I also had to get affidavits from colleagues that were down there with me. As the years go by and memories fade, it becomes more difficult to remember who you were standing next to 17 years ago, especially in such chaos as we were in. Also, after having been sick, to try and track these records down, go to precincts to try and get copies of things, it's almost insurmountable. So,
We'll go through, going back, when you went to the room when the memo books were located and the documents were located. They didn't want you to go in and help out.
Oh, yes. When I had spoken with the pension section, and they had explained to me that they did have documents, but there was no particular order in terms of precinct or date or anything else. I did offer to go down and arrange them all in some sort of date order, precinct, shift, so that they could organize the roll calls, detail rosters, and command logs, and I was turned down.
So I'm pretty sure the press.
Sorry.
Yes, that's it. Detective Dedanzine is still. She's going in to apply next week, and so she's still active member of service. So she's not going to respond, but her case isn't typical. And if there's any questions you want to ask specifically on her case, I am open to answer it for her, but I don't want her to go on record and have any problem with the pension board in any retaliatory manner. But also, Lieutenant Maureen is here. This is her husband standing next to her. He's a retired detective as well. He was also assigned in the 8A precinct. So I will open it to any questions that you will have that they can help clear up or fill in any blanks. Well, I received a number of calls, as I stated, going back 2 years ago, and I didn't know it was this widespread. and then I received a call from Detective Dedanzine, and after I put out a call to try to get a list of it, we were inundated with the number of calls, so we don't know if it's in the hundreds, because many officers are not going to, may not find out their illnesses until far into the future that's related to 9/11, and the number of cases of people who are stated they can't find their old memo books, the department don't seem to have their information. We need to really filter this out, and that is why the hearings are important, to find out. I think this can impact hundreds of officers who responded. Yes, what happens, there are two phases to your request for disability. The first, you go in front of the medical board who makes a determination that you are actually ill. These officers here, they're not talking about having a cold or the flu. They have a documented, serious, severe illness. And after that is approved, then you go in front of the pension board. That's the second level. And if the pension board denies you, now you go back and start the process all over again. And it is taxing, as Maureen shared, just going through the chemo, going back and forth, the illness, just what it puts on your body is just unbelievable. I believe that, I don't believe in conspiracies, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And I am challenged, an agency that I spent 22 years with, and I'm impressed with our abilities to retain records. As I stated, we can go back to the early 1900s and find a command log that would have who was on the desk and what entry. You mean to tell me we cannot find all of the 9/11 related records that was turned over to the law department? Something just doesn't sit right. In anticipation, these records were turned over in anticipation of any lawsuits. And so is there a desire to try to have these officers get frustrated and stop pursuing this? Is there a desire that says that, how many of these officers are going to be around? I don't know, but I know something is not right. There's no way the law department and the police department should not be able to document every record on 9/11 that took place. The people who were assigned to the law department and the police department moving those papers around, they were not digging in the dust at ground zero. And so they had time to make sure that this was documented in the proper fashion. These officers were not sitting behind the desk. They were digging through dust. And it's unfortunate that those who were not digging through the dust are giving these officers who dug through the dust this difficult way of making sure that their medical conditions is addressed.
I have, but I'm waiting. But that's not what this is about. Why I'm really here is because I think it's a shame that some people have bona fide illness from September 11th, and you need to get an affidavit, plus they don't have any records. If you don't have your memo book, or you can't prove it now that you're out. Well, I have not reapplied to the pension board.
And I think that when you look at the president of the superior officers' comments, that they denied him, and it was only because of a single radio transmission that he was able to stumble on and find, that they finally realized that he was actually there, but he was denied. And when you look at the case with Maureen, who they stated that she was not there, she was 4 hours shy of being there on time, and she had to go and dig out memo books to show that she was more than those number of hours that they required. This is horrendous, and each time I receive a call from an officer who is battling chemo, who has undergone several surgeries, And these were guys I knew. These was guys that patrolled the city with me. These were people who I was involved in. You know, these three officers that are here, two detectives and a retired lieutenant, these weren't strangers. These were people I spent a substantial part of my life with. And to hear that they are battling these injuries is one thing. You reach out and give them the support that you need. But to also hear that they're battling the pension board, that cannot happen.
Is this unique? Does the pension board deny other people for others? Is this kind of a regular thing for them, or is it unique to the situation? Unusual?
The pension board is known from time to time to stringently look over an officer's request to go out on line of duty related injuries. And we understand that, and we should do. We should be diligent in doing so to make sure the injury is related to their line of duty, and that is understood. But the uniqueness of what these officers are going through, particularly when the reason many of them are being denied is not because they're stating you do not have a 9/11 related injury. They're stating that you do not have the documentation to prove you were at ground zero. Documentation that they lost. So they lost the documentation. Now they come into these offices and say, that's your problem, not our problem. It's not making much sense to me.
When did this transfer of records from the NYPD to the law department? When did that occur?
We're not sure, and I think that those are some of the questions that hopefully the men and women of the media can obtain from the police department, and we're hoping that the hearings are held. Sometimes with hearings, people all of a sudden find things that are lost. And so we are hoping that Councilman Richards and Councilman Torres will bring in those involved and answer the question, where are all these records? We should be able to account for every document that took place on September 11th. That's the police department I know. If we can find every record we had on 9/10 and every record we had after that, then we should be able to find those records on 9/11.
Do you know what the other, aside from having to have multiple forms of proof that you were there, what are the other standards for successfully applying for disability pension? Are there other criteria?
The first is the medical board, getting past the medical board, which looks at the list of already indicated by the World Trade Center Health Program. They already indicate, here are the illnesses that we identify as being 9/11 related. They already did the hard part. The medical board then examines the officer's documentation, his or her records. They look at it, they scrutinize it, they make sure, okay, is this a real injury? And once they do that, then we're supposed to go to the easy part. The easy part is going and just dealing with the bureaucracy of substantiating what the medical board has and their doctors have already approved. So the most easy part has become the most challenging part, and it's bureaucratic red tape that is preventing these officers from going on with their lives.
As a first responder yourself during 9/11, can you speak to what the documentation process was like after 9/11? I would imagine that people weren't necessarily that concerned with doing roll calls and those kinds of things. Can you speak to that?
On September 11th, 17 years ago, when I walked into the command after seeing both buildings collapse, the last thing on my mind was what forms to fill out, what items should be saved, what memo book entries I was going to make. The goal was to, number one, secure the city, because we don't know if the attack was going to continue and we didn't know what we were up against. Find those officers, the number of first responders who died, and many of them were people we knew, getting there to find those officers. Just the uncertainty of the really being stunned. And there was very little concern of let's ensure we have every name entered, let's ensure that every redeployment of personnel was properly documented. That was just not the case. We were writing on the back of pieces of paper or napkins, of making notes later. We were trying to document the movement as best we can and best we could, but the reality was it was impossible. It was helter-skelter in the city. And during that process, the last thing you were thinking about is that should I have the right memo book entry so 17 years later, if I come up with a 9/11 related illness, I'll be able to document it. The term 9/11 related illness was not even in the vocabulary of those officers who were responding. This is a retrospective response, and it was not the perspective we had during that time. When an officer receives a on-duty injury that prevent him or her from continuing their job because they are physically unable to do so, they have an opportunity to go out on a retirement pension. This is with the understanding that this officer would never be able to do any form of real full-time employment, or they would have some major illnesses that would prevent them from doing so. That board reviews the documentation of this officer's injuries and makes a determination that this officer is injured to a capacity that he can no longer do his job as a police officer and can't really hold down full-time employment at the same level, or will reach a point that he's going to be unable to do so. That is the role of the board. What is unique here is that board is expanding beyond that and saying, now we want you to prove that you were actually here without any consistent pattern of proof. Every other case, we're getting different scenarios of what they're looking for. And so this is bureaucracy, red tape on steroids. When each time an officer goes in front of someone, they're giving them a different set of rules and standards that they gave to someone else. It is like dealing with an insurance company that you paid your insurance every month, but once you got into an accident, all of a sudden they can't find your check.
And people get a percentage of what they made through the pension fund, or?
No, it's not a percentage of what you made or your salary. It is a percentage of your salary. It's 3/4 of your salary that you will receive based on the injuries that you sustain. I heard last week, I believe, the FBI director talked about how we have to give more support. I don't know if in particular if he was talking about the FBI agents or federal employees who are also responders. We see the fire department pension section doing an amazing job. We had an amazing fight for the Zogra Act, and we were able to pass it. So the table is set. And I think that the FBI director feels the same energy that many of these officers are being left behind. Now it's time for us to provide them with the resources that they need. I believe that that energy is resonating throughout the country because we're 17 years away. This is the byproduct of that attack, and it's only going to get worse. And if we don't fix this problem now, we're going to have a large number of officers and first responders who are going to go without the necessary care that they deserve. We should have leadership from all over the country. once people realize what is happening to these officers and is representative of what is going to happen in the future, we want everyone's voice to chime in and state we must fix this problem. But it starts here. We have two aggressive city council persons, Richards and Torres, and we're going to ask both of them to get on top of this. Find those documents. They must be the detectives to force the police department to find those documents. It is unacceptable that they don't have those documents and that we're not allowing one standard of proof to resolve this matter.
Just so we're clear, as Brooklyn Borough President, people come to you from the borough and travel, you're also saying it's a citywide issue.
Yes, as the Brooklyn Borough President, I have received calls from not only in Brooklyn, but throughout the entire city. Because not only am I the Borough President, many people know I was a former captain. And one day I could be in the same situation that I am going to have to look for these documents, and I have no clue where my memo books are located. I need this police department to have their records. So people reached out to me as the Borough President and as a former captain in the New York City Police Department and as a person who dug in that pile of toxic dirt and dust. Thank you. Thank you.
Be well, Vanessa. Take care of yourself. Yeah, you too. I know. Well, feel well. Yes, you too.